The morning Marta Holacek drove a wooden stake into the cracked earth south of Mesilla, New Mexico territory. The temperature had already climbed past 97 degrees Fahrenheit before 9 o'clock. It was the third week of June, 1874, and the land around her was the color of a bleached bone. 3 men leaning on a fence post 100 yards away watched her work. One of them laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh that men offer when they're uncertain. The hard kind, the kind that carries a message written in contempt. She didn't look up. She drove the second stake, then the third. The land was hers. 160 acres of high desert scrubland she'd claimed under the Homestead Act after her husband Thomas died of typhoid 2 seasons earlier, somewhere on the trail between Albuquerque and Las Cruces. She'd buried him herself at the side of the road with help from a Navajo family who'd passed by and seen her kneeling in the dust. She didn't speak their language. They didn't speak hers. But they understood the weight of what she was carrying, and they stayed until it was done. That was more than most had given her. What nobody along the Rio Grande Valley understood, what made those men laugh, what made the women in town shake their heads and cluck softly into their hands, was what Marta planned to build on that patch of cracked caliche and sparse creosote. She wasn't going to cut timber. She wasn't going to import brick. She wasn't going to haul any lumber at all, which was the standard approach out here where wood cost more per board foot than most families spent on food in a week. She was going to build her house out of the ground she was standing on, and she was going to build it so well that it would still be standing when her grandchildren were old. Marta Holacek was going to build with mud, not just any mud and not in any ordinary way, but the neighbors didn't know that yet. All they saw was a slight Czech woman with work-roughened hands and quiet gray eyes driving stakes into dirt, measuring off a rectangle 36 feet long by 22 feet wide, using a length of knotted rope and a method she'd learned from an old man in a village near Brno before she'd ever heard the word America. Her walls, when she was done, would be nearly 24 inches thick. Her home would cost her roughly $4 in purchased materials: lime, a small iron door hinge, and a single glass window pane. Everything else would come from the ground beneath her feet. The men by the fence couldn't have known what they were looking at. That's the thing about knowledge that travels quietly across centuries. It doesn't announce itself. It just works. Her nearest neighbor was Ezra Dunmore, a Kansas-born homesteader who'd been in the territory for 11 years and considered himself, with reasonable justification, an authority on building in the desert. He was 54 years old, lean as a whittled stick, and genuinely not a cruel man. His skepticism wasn't born of spite. It was born of experience. He'd watched 4 homesteads fail inside of 2 years. He'd seen a family lose everything to a flash flood that came down out of the Oregon mountains without warning and turned the arroyo near their place into a 20-foot wall of brown water moving at speed. He'd lost half a barn roof to a haboob, a dust storm, that rolled in from the south like a curtain being pulled across the entire sky at once. He knew this land the way you know something that can kill you without raising its voice. "Miss Holacek," he told her, the second day she was out there working, "adobe won't hold in a flood. You know that, right? Water gets into the mud, and it's back to mud. You'll have nothing left but a pile of wet dirt." He wasn't trying to discourage her. He was trying to save her the trouble. She listened to him the way she listened to most things, completely, without interrupting, with a focused attention that some men found disconcerting in a woman. Then she said, "I know what adobe fails to do, Mr. Dunmore. I also know what it does not fail to do." Her English was careful and slightly formal, the kind of English learned from books before being tested in conversation. She'd been in the country 4 years. Ezra Dunmore went home and told his wife Loretta that the Czech widow was going to have a hard lesson come monsoon season. Loretta, who had a sharper eye for people than her husband and always had, said maybe so, and went back to churning butter. The second skeptic arrived on the 4th day, Colonel Thaddeus Pemberton, retired Army Corps of Engineers, now working as a surveyor and occasional land speculator in the Mesilla Valley. Rode up on a bay horse and sat watching Marta work for nearly 20 minutes before he introduced himself. He was 61 years old, white-mustached, and thoroughly accustomed to being listened to on matters of construction. He had built fortifications from Georgia to Texas. He'd seen adobe structures used by the Mexican army and by the Pueblo peoples to the north, and he had formed careful opinions about all of them. "The Pueblo Indians built with adobe for centuries," he allowed. When Marta asked for his assessment, But they built thick, and they built high, and they built in communities where maintenance was constant and communal. A single woman maintaining a structure of this type, in this climate, is a different proposition entirely. He paused to let that settle. The summer storms here produce rainfall that would turn your walls to slurry in 20 minutes. I've surveyed this valley for 3 years. I've seen what water does to unprotected earthen walls. Then it is good, Marta said, that I do not plan to leave my walls unprotected. He waited for her to explain. She went back to measuring. He tipped his hat and rode away with the distinct impression that he had been, very politely, dismissed. The third voice of opposition came from Reverend Caleb Stout, who led the small Methodist congregation that met in a timber-framed building on the north edge of Mesilla. He stopped by on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to welcome her to the area, in reality to understand what she was doing. He was 48, broad-shouldered, a former Ohio farmer before the Lord had called him westward, and he had a particular gift for framing concern as charity. "We have a community building fund," he told her gently. "Several families have contributed to help new settlers construct proper homes. You wouldn't need to do this alone." He gestured at the site, the staked rectangle, the piles of excavated earth, the wooden forms she'd built from salvaged timber. "There's no shame in accepting what the community offers." Marta thanked him with a warmth that was completely genuine. She had nothing against Reverend Stout or his congregation. She simply didn't need their help, and she told him so without apology. He left puzzled, which was, she reflected, at least more interesting than having him leave certain. The fourth voice was the sharpest, a woman named Agnes Carver, wife of the territory's most successful carpenter, a man who built homes and commercial buildings across 3 counties. Agnes was 38, well-dressed by frontier standards with a direct manner that cut through pleasantry like a hand plane through pine. She arrived with a genuine apple pie and said, over coffee, what the others had been dancing around. "My husband says a mud house won't stand a year out here, not in this valley. The floods come fast and they come hard, and the alkali in the soil makes the clay work against itself. He's repaired 3 adobe structures that fell apart inside of 2 seasons. He says it's not worth a woman's time alone." She paused. "He's usually right about construction." "That is because," Marta said, pouring a second cup, "those structures were made with the wrong earth and the wrong mix, and built without a base course and without a plaster coat, and probably without a proper overhang on the roof, which is exactly why they failed." She said it without condescension, just the way you state a fact verified by direct observation. "Thank you for the pie, Mrs. Carver. It is very good." Agnes Carver rode home with the empty pie tin and the uncomfortable feeling that she might be wrong about something important. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know we dig into exactly these kinds of stories, moments when ancient knowledge collides with frontier skepticism, and the results change everything. If this is your first time here, subscribe before we go further. The builders and survivors on this frontier had solutions to problems that we've largely forgotten, and preserving that knowledge is exactly what we're here to do. Hit that subscribe button and join the people keeping these stories alive. What Marta was building had a name, adobe, but calling it mud was like calling a fine-tuned rifle a metal stick. The technique she was using wasn't improvised. It came from a lineage that stretched back further than the American frontier had any right to claim. The ancient Egyptians built with sun-dried mud brick along the Nile for 4,000 years. The Yemeni city of Shibam, which Marta had never heard of, had earthen towers 10 stories tall that had stood for 5 centuries without a pound of Portland cement. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest had been refining adobe construction for 1,000 years before the first Spaniard set foot in New Mexico, raising multi-story buildings at Taos that outlasted every wooden structure the pioneers had erected on the frontier. Marta had learned her version from a man named Václav Procházka in Moravia, who'd spent 2 years in Algeria watching French colonial engineers study Berber construction methods, and who'd come home convinced that the ancient knowledge of building with earth was more reliable in certain climates than anything the Industrial Revolution had produced. What she knew, and what Ezra Dunmore and Colonel Pemberton and every other skeptical voice in the valley didn't know, was that adobe fails for specific, entirely correctable reasons. Most failures trace back to 3 problems. First, wrong soil composition. Too much sand, too much clay, not enough of the stabilizing middle ground that gives dried earth its structural integrity. Second, no protection at the wall base. Flood splash and capillary moisture wick upward into unprotected earthen walls and erode them from the ground up slowly and invisibly, until one wet season, the whole base crumbles. Third, bare exterior walls left to direct weathering instead of being coated with a lime plaster that sheds water rather than absorbing it. Fix those three things systematically, with materials tested before a single course was laid, and you didn't just have a structure that survived the desert. You had a structure the desert couldn't touch. The soil south of Mesilla was, almost by geological luck, nearly ideal. She'd tested it before she filed her claim, pressing it into a ball between her palms, letting it dry in the sun, pressing it again, watching where and how it fractured. The caliche subsoil below the topsoil had the right balance, roughly 25% clay, 55% silt, and 20% fine sand, with natural mineral binders that gave the dried material a compressive strength that would have surprised Colonel Pemberton considerably had he thought to measure it. She added dried grass, sacaton grass specifically, cut from the arroyos where it grew in stands reaching 4 feet tall, at a ratio of approximately 1 good handful per cubic foot of mix. The grass was not filler, it was structure. The earth handled compression, the weight pressing down from above. The grass fibers handled tension, the pulling forces that tried to split the wall when it flexed under wind load or sudden temperature change. Together they handled what New Mexico storms were capable of delivering, which was, as anyone in the valley could attest, quite a great deal. The mix was tested before she used it on the actual structure. She made 30 test bricks, dried them in full desert sun for 8 days until they rang with a hollow note when tapped, then subjected them to every abuse she could manage. 2 hours of soaking in a water trough, strikes with a wooden mallet, prying at a corner with an iron bar. 27 of the 30 survived in acceptable condition. She adjusted the grass ratio upward by about 15% and made 20 more bricks. These she dropped from shoulder height onto hard caliche ground. 18 didn't crack. She began building. The foundation was not adobe. That was the first mistake most people made. Starting earthen walls at grade level in perpetual contact with whatever moisture the desert provided. The bottom 2 courses of Marta's walls were flat-laid sandstone, quarried herself from an outcropping 3/4 of a mile east using a hand sledge and a steel wedge. Each stone ran roughly 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. She hauled them on a 2-wheeled cart behind a mule she'd bought for $11 from a departing miner heading back to Colorado. The stone base lifted her adobe walls a full 8 inches off the ground, above flood splash level, above the capillary zone where ground moisture wicked upward, above the zone where a season of rain and wind found its best grip on earthen material. On top of the stone, she began laying adobe bricks. Each brick was 10 inches by 14 inches by 4 inches thick, larger than the standard Mexican adobe she'd seen in Albuquerque, sized to her handspan and to her target wall thickness. She made them herself in wooden forms, carrying water from a 34-foot hand-dug well in 2 buckets on a shoulder yoke, mixing earth with feet and hands and a wooden paddle, pressing the mix into forms, turning them out onto flat ground to cure in the sun for 7 full days. A single wet brick weighed 23 pounds. Dry, it settled at 17 pounds. She made 48 of them before she laid the first course against the stone foundation. In the first 3 weeks of work, she lost 12 pounds from her frame that she didn't entirely have to spare, and she went to sleep every night with hands too sore to close fully and woke every morning and opened them slowly before she tried to stand. There's a particular kind of certainty that comes from building something with your own hands out of material you've tested and understood. Different from hiring a craftsman, different from purchasing prefabricated goods. It carries the weight of direct knowledge. You know this will hold, because you know precisely why it will hold. Marta had that certainty in the set of her shoulders and the economy of her movements. She didn't second-guess her measurements. She didn't remake decisions already made. She moved through the work with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd thought everything through before she started, and who trusted what she'd thought. Ezra Dunmore came by twice a week. He told himself it was welfare concern. A widow alone, building alone. And that was true enough. But in truth, he was watching the walls go up with a growing unease he couldn't entirely account for. They were straight. They were plumb, She checked with a plumb line of string and a stone and adjusted course heights until the line hung true before she moved on. They were solid. The joints between bricks were tighter than he'd expected, and the courses were level in a way that spoke of patience and attention he hadn't anticipated. And they were thick. By the time they reached the height of his shoulder, the walls were 22 inches of packed earth and dried grass, and they had the presence of something permanent. Not the feeling you got from timber frame construction, which always seemed provisional to Ezra, like something assembled and therefore reassemblable. More like looking at a hillside that happened to have corners. He didn't say any of this. He asked how she was managing water supply, and she told him she'd deepened the well to 34 feet and struck a good vein. He nodded, went home, and thought about it longer than he'd planned. The walls reached their full height of 9 feet in the 7th week of construction. Marta rested 3 days, sorting and trimming cottonwood roof poles she'd cut from the acequia to the north, letting them continue to air dry. Then she turned to the roof, which was where most earthen structures in the territory made their critical error. A poor roof was, in her estimation, responsible for more adobe failures than any other single cause. Water striking the wall top was more dangerous than water at the base, for a reason that wasn't immediately obvious. It hit the wall surface where the protection of an overhang was thinnest and where recently laid material was least consolidated. Flat roofs without adequate drainage pooled water against the parapet. A small persistent leak at the top could work its way down into the wall body and undermine 3 to 4 feet of otherwise sound construction in a single monsoon. She had no intention of repeating that failure pattern. She built a low-pitched roof on cottonwood poles, 6 inches in diameter, spaced 18 inches apart. Over the poles, she laid a dense mat of ocotillo ribs and dried river cane, the lightweight structural base that provided support without adding excessive load to the walls below. Over that, she laid a 6-inch course of earth mixed with lime in a ratio of 8 parts earth to 1 part lime. The lime was her principal purchase material, 40 pounds of it from a Mesilla hardware merchant for $1.80, the single largest line item in her entire construction budget. Worth every cent. Lime reacts with clay minerals to form calcium silicate compounds, hardening the earth mix into something substantially more water-resistant than raw clay alone. Her lime-stabilized roof plaster shed water where untreated clay would have absorbed it. The difference under a driving monsoon rain was not subtle. Adobe with lime roof plaster versus untreated earth roofing in heavy rainfall, roughly 55% less surface water penetration. The roof overhang extended 18 inches beyond the wall face on all 4 sides, enough to deflect the first splash of rainfall away from the base, enough to shade the south wall and drop its surface temperature by 12 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit on a July afternoon when the open desert was cooking at 105. She shaped the overhang from salvaged planking with a slight downward pitch, channeling runoff away from the structure in all directions into flat stone-lined drainage channels she dug in the surrounding soil. Then she plastered the exterior walls. Base coat first, earth mixed with chopped straw, worked into the surface with a wooden float to fill voids and create a mechanical key for the finish coat. 5 days to dry. Then the finish coat, lime plaster, troweled smooth and burnished slightly with a wet cloth while still workable. When fully cured, it was hard enough to deflect a fingernail. But Marta added one more ingredient to that final coat. Something she'd learned not from Václav Prochaska and not from any book, but from a Tohono O'odham woman she'd traded with near Tucson during the overland journey north, the spring before Thomas died. The woman had shown her by pressing the pulp of a prickly pear cactus pad into wet lime plaster and smoothing the surface, then pouring water over it. The water ran off in sheets rather than drops. The woman had smiled and said something in her own language. Marta hadn't understood the words. She'd understood the demonstration perfectly. The polysaccharide compounds in cactus pulp bond with calcium silicate hydrate in the lime surface, filling microscopic pores that would otherwise allow water to wick inward from the exterior. Somebody had figured that out a very long time ago in a field because their house was going to fail if they didn't solve the problem before the next storm. That's where this knowledge lived, not in books, but in the hands of people who needed it to work. The interior walls got earth plaster only, no lime. A deliberate choice. The slight porosity of interior earthen plaster allowed moisture vapor generated inside by cooking and breathing to move through the wall and evaporate from the exterior. This vapor exchange was part of the thermal regulation system, and that system was about to matter more than anything else Marta had built. An adobe wall 22 inches thick carries what engineers would later call thermal mass, the capacity to absorb heat slowly during the day, store it, and release it gradually through the cool of the evening. In practice, in New Mexico in July, this meant the blistering midday heat simply couldn't penetrate Marta's walls fast enough to warm the interior before the desert air had already begun to cool. On an afternoon when outside temperature reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of her house held at 74 degrees. No ice, no cellar fan, no shade trees yet, just walls 22 inches thick with proper plaster, and in the high desert, that was enough. William Carver, Agnes's husband, 34 structures built across the territory, a man with no patience for nonsense or pretense, walked through the finished structure in late August. Outside temperature was 103 degrees. He put his palm flat against the interior wall and held it there for several seconds. He looked at his wife. He looked at Marta. Then quietly, to no one in particular, "I'll be damned." Marta offered him coffee. He accepted without hesitation. He spent an hour examining the foundation detail, the wall-base junction, the roof overhang depth, the lime plaster hardness. He asked Marta technical questions that grew progressively more specific as his initial certainty gave ground. She answered all of them without hedging. When he left, he'd said more about earth construction in 60 minutes than he'd said to anyone on the subject in his professional life. Not converted, not fully, not yet. But the certainty he'd carried through her door was considerably dented, and dents in a careful man's certainty have a way of growing wider on their own. Now we're coming to the part that changes everything. And if you're new here, this is the right moment to subscribe and make sure you don't miss how this resolves. Every frontier story we tell on this channel ends in proof. Real, undeniable, empirical proof. Join us. Help keep this knowledge documented. The test came in September. September in the Mesilla Valley was monsoon season's last gasp, the time when moisture patterns pushing north from the Gulf of Mexico sent their final surge through the desert southwest, and the landscape, parched from months of relentless sun, sometimes received more rain in 48 hours than it would see in all the preceding spring and summer combined. The summer of 1874 had been dry even by local standards. The arroyos had been dust channels since May. The Rio Grande was running 40% below its seasonal average. The cattle were thin, the grass was tender. And then, on the evening of September 14th, the sky to the south of Mesilla turned the particular shade of charcoal green that old-timers in the valley recognized and newcomers were about to learn about firsthand. Ezra Dunmore saw it at 4 in the afternoon from his upper field and spent exactly 3 minutes deciding what to do, then drove his wagon hard to collect his sister's family 2 miles east. Colonel Pemberton secured his own building and rode north to warn the settlement near the river bend. Reverend Stout opened his church as a general shelter and rang the bell continuously for 20 minutes. In houses and barns and sheds scattered across the valley, people moved with the focused urgency of those who had either lived through this or heard enough to know what was coming. Marta Holacek put her mule in the livestock room she'd built against the south wall of the main house, same 22-inch construction, 12 feet by 16 feet, stone base course, lime plaster coat, and latched the door firmly. She brought her water supply indoors. She banked her cook fire. She sat down at her table with her lamp and the only book she owned, a Czech translation of a German text on soil mechanics she'd found in an Albuquerque bookshop for 30 cents, the one extravagance she'd permitted herself all summer. And she waited. What came first was not rain. What came first was the haboob. The dust wall arrived from the southwest at roughly 6 in the evening, a brown cliff 800 feet high moving at an estimated 45 miles per hour, its leading edge curling forward at the top like a wave about to break. The sound preceded the visual by about 30 seconds, not wind exactly, but something denser and more mechanical, the sound of millions of sand particles in collective motion across miles of open desert. The temperature dropped 22 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 minutes. Then, inside the brown darkness of the storm, the rain began. Not the gradual building rain of a normal afternoon storm. The vertical wall of water rain of a full desert cloud storm. The kind of rain that falls so fast the ground can't absorb it, so it runs. Everything runs. Every surface that isn't level collects it and sends it somewhere else, faster and faster, until a dry arroyo that was carrying dust at noon is carrying 6 feet of water at 7 in the evening and still rising. The arroyo running through Ezra Dunmore's property stood 300 yards from his main house, normally far enough. The earthen berm he'd built over 3 years of field clearing stood between the arroyo and his barn. In a normal monsoon it held fine. In this monsoon the berm absorbed water until it was saturated through, and then a 30-foot section of it simply moved. Not a sudden collapse, but steadily, the way something gives up when it's done. The water came through where the berm had been and hit the northeast corner of Ezra's barn at speed. His stone foundation held. The timber frame walls did not hold in the same sense. Scouring around the foundation corner removed 8 inches of soil, the structure settled unevenly, and the wall frame on that side cracked. The barn didn't fall, but it wasn't right anymore and wouldn't be until spring. The Carver's property, half a mile north of Marta's claim, lost 3 sections of roof shingles to the wind, lifted clean off and either shredded or carried entirely away. The exposed roof boards absorbed water for 6 straight hours. By morning, William Carver's interior ceiling had sagged visibly in one corner where swollen rafters had lost their calculated geometry. He stood under it with the look of a man calculating 6 months of repair work he hadn't planned for. 3 miles east, a family named Tibbs, James and Margaret from Illinois, 3 children ages 4 to 11, lost their roof entirely. They'd built quickly with green lumber not properly seasoned, and the combined wind load and rain weight had been too much for the ridge beam. The ridge snapped. The children were unhurt, sheltered that night with Reverend Stout, but the family had no shelter of their own. The flour, the cornmeal, the dried beans, meant to sustain them through winter. All of it soaked or lost to the mud. The arroyo that ran 180 yards north of Marta's property crested at 11 feet above its dry season bed, the highest reading anyone with more than 3 years in the valley had ever seen it reach. Water spread into the flats for 40 feet on either side of the channel before absorption could slow it. It came within 90 feet of the northeast corner of Marta's walls. She could hear it from inside, a sound like a freight train running on no track at all, moving fast and indifferent through the darkness outside her lime-plastered walls. She lit her lamp. She read her book for 2 hours while the storm hammered the desert outside and the wind threw sand against her walls like thrown gravel. The sound was loud. It was not frightening. She knew what those walls were made of. She knew what they could take because she'd spent a summer testing the material before she built with it. That knowledge is a specific kind of comfort. It is, in fact, the only kind that holds in a situation like that one. At midnight, the rain stopped. At 3 in the morning, the wind dropped to nothing. She blew out the lamp and slept. In the morning, Ezra Dunmore was the first to come by. He arrived on foot, having lost a wheel off his wagon in the dark. It had caught a rut on the drive home from his sister's at 2 in the morning and simply come off. He was tired and mud-streaked and carrying the look of a man who had been wrong in a way that cost him something. Not money, not property. Certainty, which is sometimes harder to lose than either of those. He stopped outside her front door, which she'd left open to the morning air, and looked at her walls. The lime plaster was streaked with the paths of water that had run down its surface and drained off the overhang into the stone-lined channels below. No erosion marks, no softened sections, no cracks at the base where water might have pooled and penetrated. The southeast corner, which had faced the wind most directly, showed fine surface pitting from the sandblast, slightly roughened, like old leather. He reached out and pressed his thumb against it, firm. He pressed harder. Nothing gave. "How much damage?" he asked. "Some surface pitting on the south and east faces," she said from inside, already making coffee. "I will replaster those sections in the spring." The walls themselves took no damage. He stood there a moment. "The Tibbs family lost their roof." "I heard," she said. "They can stay here while they rebuild, if they need to." She came to the doorway with 2 cups. "Come in, Mr. Dunmore. Have coffee." He came in. He looked around the interior, at the walls that had been outside in a haboob and a flash flood and now felt, under his hand, as solid as the earth they came from. The inside temperature was perhaps 68 degrees, while outside the morning sun was already driving the air past 80. He sat down at her table and wrapped both hands around the cup and was quiet for a long time. "I've been building in this territory for 11 years, he said at last. "I know," she said. "I didn't know about the lime plaster or the prickly pear. Very few people do," she said. "It is old knowledge, very old." He drank his coffee. Somewhere to the north he could hear William Carver already starting repairs, the methodical sound of a man who knows what to do next and has started doing it. Closer, the arroyo still ran, lower now, carrying the tail of last night's water south toward the Rio Grande. "What would it cost," Ezra Dunmore said slowly, "to build a small structure on my property? For storage, something that could take water?" Marta considered it with appropriate seriousness. $4, perhaps $5, for the lime and the purchased materials, she said. "The rest is earth and grass and labor." She paused. "I will show you, if you want to know." He set down his cup. "I want to know," he said. Colonel Pemberton came by that afternoon, still on horseback, still wearing the expression of a man revising his assessments in real time. He circled the house twice before dismounting. He spent 40 minutes examining it: the foundation course, the roof pitch, the wall thickness at top versus bottom, which narrowed by approximately 2 inches per 3 feet of rise and increased structural stability under lateral wind load. He asked Marta questions that grew progressively more technical as he went. She answered everything with the same measured patience she'd shown throughout the summer, the patience of someone who'd known all along what this moment would look like. "You've studied this seriously," he said. Not a question, an acknowledgement. "For many years," she said. He was quiet. Then, "The Army built adobe fortifications in Arizona Territory in the 1860s. I always thought it was a compromise, using what was available because timber was scarce." He looked at her walls again, at the lime-plastered surface that had just endured a night he wouldn't have wanted to spend outdoors in a frame building. "I may have been wrong about that." "Perhaps," Marta said, "it was not a compromise. Perhaps it was the correct choice, and the people who chose it knew it was, and the people before them knew it, for a very long time." Pemberton nodded slowly. He had the look of a man filing information away in a mental folder he'd labeled incorrectly for years and was now relabeling. He thanked her, mounted his horse, and rode toward Mesilla, where several of the community's timber frame buildings had sustained damage that would keep carpenters busy well into October. Reverend Stout came the next day with the Tibbs family in tow, James and Margaret and 3 children, the youngest with a cough the previous night's weather hadn't helped. Marta had already made up bedding in the livestock room, warm and dry, smelling of clean straw. They moved in. They stayed 6 weeks while their rebuilt roof went up, and in those 6 weeks, Marta taught James Tibbs everything she knew about adobe construction. He was a quick learner with carpenter's instincts. By the time he went home, he'd made 200 practice bricks, understood the soil testing process, the lime plaster application, the critical importance of the stone base course. When his grandchildren were grown, he still had a storage structure he'd built the spring after the storm. Agnes Carver brought another pie at the end of September, apple this time, from a tree she'd coaxed into bearing on desert soil over 5 careful years. She sat down across from Marta and said, with the directness she'd always had, "My husband wants to know if you'd be willing to consult with him on a project. He's building a commercial structure in Las Cruces. He thinks what you've done here might apply." "It will certainly apply," Marta said. Agnes smiled, small, genuine. "He thought you'd say that." The news of what Marta Holacek's house had survived spread through the valley the way important news always spread on the frontier. Slowly at first, through direct account and second-hand report, then with gathering speed as the physical evidence accumulated. People came to see it. They touched the walls. They stood inside on hot afternoons and felt the temperature difference with their own skin. They pressed their thumbs into the lime plaster and found it unyielding. They looked at the neighbors' patched roofs and cracked barn walls and rethought their own building plans. Not everyone was converted. The lumber trade in the territory was controlled by men with a financial interest in timber construction, backed by the railroad now pushing through the Southwest, bringing eastern materials at prices that undercut local production. The argument that wood was modern and earth was primitive was a useful argument for people selling wood. Progress in 1874 was a word that carried tremendous moral weight, and adobe had been used by people who didn't have railroads. For some folks, that settled the question before it was asked. But among the 17 families within 3 miles of Marta's claim who'd seen a haboob and a flash flood and come away with wet flour and missing roofs, the conversation was different. Families who might have asked what that kind of construction cost in money now asked what it cost in labor, and learned that the labor was substantial but learnable, not a craft requiring specialized tools or years of guild training, just knowledge and time and a willingness to work with the earth rather than against it. 4 of those 17 families began new structures using her techniques within 18 months. James Tibbs built a storage room that was still standing and in use when his grandchildren were grown. The one conversion that surprised Marta most was Ezra Dunmore's. He was not a man given to sudden changes of direction. He thought about things slowly and moved on them deliberately. He appeared at her door in the evenings for 3 months, hat in hand, with specific technical questions. What do you do when the caliche layer is too shallow and you reach sand? What is the minimum wall thickness for a livestock structure built to hold through winter? How do you frame a door opening in adobe so the differential movement between wood and earth doesn't crack the plaster over time? She answered everything, thoroughly and without impatience, and she showed him when showing was better than telling, which was most of the time. In the spring of 1875, Ezra Dunmore demolished the cracked corner barn and rebuilt it. He used the stone base course. He used soil he'd tested 3 times before he was satisfied with the composition. He used the lime plaster and the prickly pear additive, which he gathered himself from the stands growing at the base of the Organ Mountains. His walls weren't quite as straight as Marta's. He was 54 and not a mason of any kind, but they were close enough. When Marta came to inspect the work and told him they were very acceptable, he felt a satisfaction that surprised him with its depth. Not the satisfaction of completion, the satisfaction of having learned something true and applied it correctly. Those are not the same thing, and a man who's built anything with his hands knows the difference. His new barn cost $6.40 in purchased materials. It was still standing in 1908, 3 years after he died, serving his daughter's family as a feed storage building. When she sold the property in 1912, the buyer from Ohio assumed the structure was stone. He only discovered otherwise when he tried to drive a nail into the wall and found it didn't behave like stone or wood, but like something else entirely, something harder to categorize and just as hard to argue with. There is a larger story inside Marta Holicek's story, one that she probably didn't fully articulate to herself, though she felt it in the work every day. It's the story of knowledge that travels, knowledge that moves across continents and centuries, encoded not in books or academic institutions, but in the hands and practices of people who needed it to survive. The Berber builders in North Africa who developed lime-stabilized plaster hadn't written technical manuals. They'd taught their children, who taught theirs. Václav Prochaska hadn't published a paper on Algerian earthen architecture. He'd come home and built things that worked, and shown other people. Marta hadn't arrived in New Mexico with an engineering degree. She'd arrived with encoded knowledge passed hand to hand across cultures and languages and oceans, and she'd tested it against the hardest proving ground available, and it had held. That's what frontier conditions did to knowledge. They stripped away everything theoretical and left only what worked. It's why that particular period produced such a dense concentration of practical wisdom, not because frontier people were smarter, but because they were paying for their mistakes immediately and personally, and the ones who survived long enough to teach others had gotten the fundamentals exactly right. Adobe that failed wasn't an interesting case study. It was a family sleeping in a roofless ruin in September, with 3 small children and winter coming on. The stakes clarified everything. Modern testing has caught up to what Marta knew empirically in 1874. Stabilized earthen construction, adobe, rammed earth, compressed earth block, has been studied rigorously by civil engineers in the last 50 years, and the results have validated every principle she used. Properly constructed adobe walls with lime plaster show compressive strengths of 300 to 500 pounds per square inch. Thermal mass calculations confirm that a 22-inch earthen wall reduces peak indoor temperatures by 25 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit compared to outside air during summer heat events. Studies of earthen structures in the American Southwest have documented examples still in active use after 200 to 300 years of continuous service. Not the exception, but the norm for well-built adobe in an appropriate climate. The cactus pulp plaster additive she learned from the Tohono O'odham woman has been analyzed chemically. The polysaccharide compounds in prickly pear pulp bond with calcium silicate hydrate in the lime surface to produce measurably reduced water absorption. Somebody figured out, a very long time ago, what it took a laboratory to confirm. That kind of discovery doesn't happen in a lab. It happens in a field, in the rain, because somebody's home is going to fail if they don't solve the problem before the next storm. Marta Holicek lived in the house she built for 23 years until 1897, when she sold the claim to a young couple from Colorado and moved to Las Cruces, where she spent her last 12 years consulting on construction projects and teaching anyone who asked what she knew about building with earth. She never made much money from it. She didn't seem particularly concerned about that. The work was the thing, and the passing on was the thing, and both of those she did well. The house itself, the structure she built for $4 of purchased materials, that her neighbors laughed at, that Ezra Dunmore predicted would dissolve in the first monsoon, that Colonel Pemberton catalogued as a primitive compromise, stood for another 31 years after she sold it, modified twice, expanded once, plastered over and replastered and changed again. The stone base course she laid in the summer of 1874 was still there, as solid as the day she quarried it from the sandstone outcropping 3/4 of a mile east, when the last residents moved out in 1928. The walls were still 22 inches thick. They were still plumb. There's a thing that happens when you build correctly with earth. You stop thinking of it as a material you're imposing form onto, and you start thinking of it as a material with its own tendencies and preferences, and your job is to understand those tendencies well enough to work with them rather than against them. The earth wants to carry compression, the grass fibers want to resist tension, the lime wants to repel water. Your job is to put those properties where they're needed and keep them there. When you do it right, the structure doesn't fight the environment. It participates in it. It breathes with the temperature. It absorbs heat and releases it on schedule. It sheds water without dissolving. It doesn't pretend to be something other than what it is. Marta Holicek didn't think of herself as making a philosophical statement when she drove those first stakes into the cracked caliche south of Mesilla. She was solving a problem. She was cold in winter and hot in summer, without materials to build the way she'd been told she was supposed to build, without money to import those materials, and in possession of knowledge that told her the solution was beneath her feet. She used what she knew, she built what worked, and the neighbors who laughed, most of them, in the end, built one too. That's the story we return to on this channel, not because it's always the same story, but because the pattern matters every time. Someone holds on to knowledge that common wisdom has forgotten, tests it on the hardest proving ground available, and lets the results speak for themselves. No argument needed, no persuasion. Just walls still standing in the morning after a storm that took everything around them. If that kind of history matters to you, the practical, the proved, the passed down, subscribe to this channel and join the community we've built around exactly these stories. Every subscriber helps us document more of this knowledge, more of these people, more of these moments when ancient wisdom met the American frontier and proved it still had something to teach. Subscribe. Help keep this from disappearing a second time. The frontier is full of stories like Marta's. Men and women who brought old knowledge into new conditions and discovered the old knowledge was more durable than anyone had credited. They didn't usually get recognized for it in their lifetimes. But the walls they built are still standing, and the techniques they used are being rediscovered by engineers who believe they're finding something new. They're not. They're just finding what was always there, buried in the earth like a foundation stone, waiting to be recognized for what it is.